Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair, and we've been talking about Pakistani politics, what's going on there with the amendments, with the drama around Imran Khan for a number of weeks now. But it's time to switch up gears a bit and talk about another election, an election that is going to be quite consequential here in the United States. Some of you have sent me messages and comments saying, when am I going to cover the elections here and who's going to win, Trump or Kamala Harris? So we're going to have that conversation with a dear friend of mine who is on the screen with us here today, Nayyera Haq. She is a seasoned communication strategist, speaker, and former White House senior director, known for her expertise in helping leaders communicate powerfully and authentically. More importantly, she's a friend of mine who I frequently call on to understand what the hell is going on in American politics whenever I'm not watching her videos on CNN and MSNBC, where she's a respected political commentator discussing global affairs, culture, and policy. She also hosts the TrailBlaze podcast and talk show on SiriusXM, where she amplifies diverse perspectives and thought leadership. So I figured if I was going to have somebody on talk about what is going on with the election, is going to be Nayyera. So Nayyera, welcome to Pakistanomy and thanks for joining us today.
It is good to be on with you, Uzair. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the fact that we are both American-Pakistanis, and some uncles from the
Mhm.
diaspora have decided to support and endorse Donald Trump. I know you have strong feelings about it, as do I.
Mhm.
And what I hear, from a lot of the folks, that there are two threads to the diaspora justification, broadly speaking, for voting for Donald Trump or endorsing him from the PAC perspective. Number one is that Joe Biden instigated regime change in Pakistan and helped oust Imran Khan, and has since then not done anything to get Imran Khan out of jail. And Donald Trump will get Imran Khan out of jail and be good for Pakistani democracy. And the second thread is, like a lot of conversations in the broader Muslim American community, is around Palestine and Gaza. So I want to start with, how do you see sort of like the American Pakistani diaspora's point of view, or at least a part of the diaspora's point of view, on Trump and these two threads that are sort of the broad common themes here?
I have so many thoughts, Uzair, and I'm going to try to keep myself calm because I know we're trying to be informative and persuasive, but it is very difficult for someone like me who had spent 20 years in and out of campaigns and in the highest levels of government, who had actually been supported initially in doing that in my first internship by the uncles who were trying to get engaged in American politics. Like, oh, let's get to know our local leaders. Let's do fundraisers, right? Like, okay, this is like 30, 40 years ago. This is where they were starting. And I appreciated that and I respected that. And just like Buddha Biden, I need those uncles to get out of the way because they're actually doing harm now. Here's what I mean. The Teamsters Union managed to, despite the differences, first do no harm. They did not endorse Trump, but they also didn't endorse Harris. Got it. There was too much dissension in their ranks for them to do that. And they effectively said, you are people who we represent. You vote your conscience. You do what you need to do. I have the utmost respect for individuals who have made a choice of how they want to vote. Voting is about lots of facts, but also about your feelings and whether or not you feel seen by the people who are supposed to be representing you. I get that. I have a really hard time with organizations that pretend to represent the Pakistani American diaspora, that have never been anointed or elected by really anybody in the broader diaspora, and then use their letterhead and their fancy titles to suggest that now this community fully endorses Trump. Why? Because for one reason, for a reason that has to do with not leadership in the United States that we will all have to deal with and live under, but leadership in the parent country, in the country of origin. What about this seems strategic or intelligent? Right? These people 40 years later are effectively giving endorsements because one dude decided to show up, take a photo, and tell them whatever they wanted to hear and agree with it. And they fell for it. Like, that to me is just absurd, that from where I started and what I have learned individually, and so many of us who have come up in this system and been integrated with the system, these are the folks who publicly decide to represent the rest of us. They're fucking idiots. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I had totally expected and hoped that our community was more sophisticated in how they navigated politics. At the If they really truly were conflicted as an organization, really truly, the best thing for them would have been not to do an endorsement at all. Because Harris wins. Who do you think they're going to throw under the bus? All of the people who at the last second decided that they wanted to move the margin of error in favor of Trump. If Trump gets elected, is there anybody in his orbit that he has ever been loyal to? Who has he not thrown under the bus? His own lawyers, his own chief of staffs, multiple people, his family members. Why would you ever consider anything him or his team says to be the honest truth? So what I see, the reason I call them fucking idiots, is because they got an over sense of power and access in this moment. They felt really good about themselves and decided they wanted to show everybody else how important they were, how cool they were. And like, you know what? This organization of doctors that I came up in, that my parents have been part of for most of their lives in the United States, all due respect to them, but rein in your political action committee, because there is zero sense that PAKPAC actually went to the community at large that they represent, which is the medical doctors, not the taxi drivers, not the economists, not the engineers. And they decided that they were just going to move with this endorsement. They walked right into Trump's hands, and they're going to get nothing for it in the long run. But I guess they got a photo and they got a pat in the back. And that apparently is 40 years later where we still are with some of our community politics. It is absolutely absurd to me.
It's absurd to me as well, and I want to go deeper because you worked on American foreign policy, right? You understand
Yes,
how
I was a
policy.
diplomat on behalf of the United States. I was an Urdu language spokesperson. I literally traveled to London, Dubai, Pakistan, Hyderabad, India to communicate about American foreign policy and gain feedback from our people in their language.
Yeah.
That was the job that I took for many years at the State Department. Then I went to the UN. Then I went to the White House. Like, I understand what it means to feel like your country is not representing your values in their foreign policy decision. I get it way more intimately than most people do. But that is actually not the reason this group gave for why they would not be voting for Kamala Harris. They didn't mention Gaza or Palestine even once.
Yeah.
Not
So
even
that's what
once.
I was going to ask you, right? Like
Like,
they
what?
mentioned that it's about Imran Khan and the fact that, there was a legislative coup,
So you are going to
etc.
throw under the bus every single Black, brown, Pakistani American living in this country because of your political belief as a non-resident Pakistani about something happening overseas. And you literally, in that process, end up aligning with the political party and the individual who is empowered and is helping Modi commit a horrific human rights crimes against Desi Muslims. But I guess we forget about that portion of our history. It doesn't matter what happens across the border as long as Imran Khan gets out of jail. Like,
And
the priorities to me, I'm like, wow, this is your priority right now. Unbelievable.
and since you follow this, right, and you followed intimately both the campaigns,
Mhm.
does Donald Trump truly believe in rule of law and democracy from
Oh,
your
and
perspective?
frankly, I don't think half of the people in Pakistan believe it either. Half of what I hear anytime I've traveled there is democracy ने हमारे लिए क्या किया? सारे corrupt ही है ना? And then now here in the United States, everyone suddenly decided that their former cricket captain is like the golden child. नहीं नहीं बड़ा अच्छा सीधा साधा अच्छा आदमी है. I'm like, really? सीधा साधा? Okay. Sure. Like I respect your opinion. I get it, but it's not based on facts. It's all feelings. Right? These are all feelings. The facts about Donald Trump are that his allies are Putin, Viktor Orban. He just praised Hitler the other day, but I guess that doesn't matter maybe to Pakistanis because, oh, they didn't come after us, they went after the Jews. Like right, like some of this old school logic does not apply to the lives that we actually have to live day to day here. And I really thought after 9/11, our community understood that as a broader
Yeah.
community, right? That there are people who will take your vote and shake your hand and take your money and take the photo and will happily put you in the police van along with everybody else just based on your name. One of the bigger issues, right, is the idea of being able to access visas for Pakistani workers, H-1B visas, family separation visas, any of these, right? Like fiance, all of that. Do you really think that Donald Trump is going to help with that? Any of that?
Yeah.
Any of the cultural exchanges? Do you know where tangerines क्या कहते हैं पाकिस्तान वो क्या किन्नू
Kinnu, yeah.
kinnu's from it's from a strain that was cultivated in the University of Nebraska
Yeah.
as one of the first exchange programs that we had, agriculture exchange programs. Like there's some really cool stuff that you can dig into and get into when you get to Pakistani American history, but that's not right. That's not what the Buddha Babas are doing. For them, it's all about what they can still influence back home. And psychologically, I think it's because they never actually appreciated and understood what it means to live in America. They never really actually integrated with the people around them and understood what's going on. And so they still have this idea, देखो अब हमारे पास तो पैसे हैं, तो हम पाकिस्तान को influence करते हैं. Like
Yeah.
I psychologically cannot understand why else this group of 10 people would decide that this is what they want to do unilaterally 10 days before an election. So now everybody in the internet thinks that Pakistani Americans are aligned with Indian Americans and Hindus and pro Modi and pro whatever fascist stuff is going on.
Yeah. And I mean, like, that's the other thing to me also was
I mean,
that
it's
this is
embarrassing. Like, let's be real.
it's
Like, it's
embarrassing and it's
embarrassing.
big news, but I also then look at the FEC filings and I'm like, it's not even $500,000 you're giving. So I'm like,
Like,
the number
what did you
isn't
give up?
even
What did
like,
you give up?
and
Like,
everyone
what
in Pakistan
integrity
is
did you give
talking
up for
about, oh
how
my
little?
God, they've endorsed Donald Trump. And I'm like, itna paisa bhi nahi hai yaar. Matlab, it's not
Nee,
even
it
half a
didn't even
million
take that
dollars.
much. No, they didn't even have to do much.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So so I
And what
want
did
to
what is it? Like, that's all you got for $500,000? Is the photo and the, oh yeah, yeah, sure, sure. Oh yeah, yeah, I'll help out Imran Khan. Oh yeah, yeah. He's a good guy. He's a great guy. Yeah, he's a
yeah.
great guy.
I had great
That's it.
chemistry. He had great chemistry with Imran Khan. So,
They had one
that's what
meeting.
everyone's banking on.
They had one meeting. What do you think he's possibly going to do? He's going to like literally use US military resources to get Imran Khan out of jail? Like this idea, right, that people have that America is this shadow hand and the ability to influence everything. I'm like, sure, if that makes you feel better about your own corruption in your country, go for it. Blame the outsider. Classic tactic, right? It's always something outside rather than looking at your own internal systems. Pakistan's, bankrupt. That's the IMF's fault. All right. I get predatory lending. That's China's game. You're not going to blame China. They're going to blame a Western institution. All right, got it. What's Pakistan's tax base? Who is actually paying taxes? Where do you think all this stuff is going to come from? But you want the easy loans for everybody else, right? Like as a system, that's what the narrative
Yeah.
is in the system. So to go into that system and I learned this very early as a diplomat, I was not going to sit there and be able to combat every conspiracy theory. And people wanted to believe what they wanted to believe about America. Got it. A big part of what I did was connecting on human values, humanitarian issues, economic development, like things that actually impact day-to-day people's lives. None of that was part of the endorsement. None of that. They didn't even get like reconstruction funding for flood, post flood. Like those are tangible things.
Yeah.
Didn't get any of that. Nothing.
Yeah. I want to switch now to the other part of the debate, right? That
Mhm.
is the broader Muslim American community. And again, we've seen sort of like with the change of guard between Biden and then on to Kamala as the running candidate for the Democrats, an initial hope that there might be some at least visible shift in rhetoric at the very least
Yeah.
and potential signals towards policy. Not much has happened. The other day we had a story about the fact that the Muslim American leader in Detroit was taken out of an event
Mhm.
where the vice president was speaking, and then they said he's welcome to come to other events and didn't really elaborate on why this happened. But again, in swing states, particularly like Michigan, as you know, there's a big Arab and Muslim American
Mhm.
population that is either signaling very clearly in polling data they'll go third party or break for Donald Trump. And this post-Iraq war, right, moment where Muslim Americans went from primarily being Republican to being Democrat voters, largely speaking. There seems to be a shift in the air. And again,
Mhm.
my question to you there is, what are your thoughts on that dynamic, right? Because again, like to me, yes, it's a very emotional issue, and I
Mhm.
understand that there are especially strong emotions among Palestinian Americans who've lost loved ones and have found that the president has one set of standards and the Democratic Party has one set of standards for Israeli Americans that are killed by terrorism, and a totally different set of standards for Palestinian or Lebanese Americans that are killed by Israeli bombs that are provided by our taxpayer dollars. How do you
I
deal with that dynamic in this cycle?
I so when I first started, I was one of the few Muslims, like people who actually even identified or willing to talk about being Muslim in government. I love how many more there are right now. But I will tell you that of the people who are engaged day-to-day in politics at local level, national level, federal, the Palestinian Americans, not broadly Muslim, but Palestinian Americans, Christian and Muslim, have been the most pragmatic about what's at stake and what's happening. And I think that's important because the narratives that we often get from ethnic language media are not necessarily representative of what Palestinians are asking for and want on a day-to-day basis or what their lived experience. It is this idea of a broader existential, the Muslim world, having been colonized and not respected for its role in history. Like it's all of this much deeper stuff that doesn't reflect what Palestinians want, what they're asking for, and B, the fact that Arab countries haven't necessarily stood up and done much to help Palestinians. Like there is an entire generation of Palestinians living as refugees in Jordan. Do you think that 1 million plus Palestinians are going to be given citizenship in Jordan anytime soon? No, right? They're barely given resources to get by day. Do you think that the Saudi government, yes, they have to take care of, the Arab street and manipulate that as they will, but the Saudi government was ready to cut a deal of recognition with Israel for economic exchanges, and because they're both anti-Iran. Very pragmatic, very obvious on the surface what was going on. But do you think at any point in that conversation there was any movement about a two-state solution or Palestinian statehood? No, because the reality on the ground has been occupation, largely one-state solution, and continued incursions in the West Bank for many years. So, right, the Saudis were willing, UAE cut their deal separate. So suddenly, Pakistanis are the standard bearers now for all of this narrative about what it means to really be Muslim and stand up for Palestinians. And I'm like, y'all aren't native Arab speakers. The people in the territory aren't doing their part. So why is it suddenly like the number one Pakistani voting issue? So I get the idea of solidarity, but people have added their own layers and their own perceptions to what's really going on here. There are several senior Palestinian American leaders working in the Democratic Party right now. And yes, they're struggling and they're having a hard time. Absolutely. Part of the hard time is, especially for those of us who came up and worked closely in the Obama administration, that the Obama administration made a very strong and obvious public effort to diversify what it means to talk about Israel and Palestine in the United States. And I specifically mean the fact that Obama called out Netanyahu at his face, and they funded, like, pretty much got into a political fight over the Iran nuclear deal, right? That was a deal that
He came to Congress to undermine that.
He was invited by the Republican majority and had the nerve to tell Democrats that they had to choose between their president and what it means to be loyal to Israel. And Chuck Schumer even was like, yo, you went too far, guy. Like Netanyahu, you went too far. Like you can't do that. And you ended up with AIPAC losing ground almost entirely among Democrats, and new organizations like J Street, who call themselves pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli. This whole idea of making pro-Palestinian issues a coordinated effort in the center of American politics, not the extreme left, but like there was a centrist. It's also generational. Under the age of 40, we don't have the experience of Yasser Arafat as the head of the terrorist PLO. Our experience was, when we were younger, we saw him and Yitzhak Rabin shake hands, and that's the last peace deal we remember. And then Yitzhak Rabin was killed by somebody from his own country, right? The same thing that happened with Anwar Sadat. Like these are the stories we know. And that was moving everything forward. That was recognizing and calling out what U.S. unconditional aid has meant to Israel. Biden didn't do any of that, right? So it's been very difficult for those of us who've been part of the Democratic Party as it's growing and moving forward to suddenly feel like we got yanked back 20, 30 years. With that said, we're under no illusion that Trump actually cares to help any of us, right? The Republican Party convention, they had a Sikh woman who is a fancy lawyer in California, gave a convocation, like the opening prayer for the convention, mostly in English, said a few words in Gurmukhi and wore a dupatta. She got booed in the crowd, was told online by other Republican activists that she was putting witchcraft on the people. Why is she on stage? This and that. I'm like, you know what? At bare minimum, that doesn't happen at Democratic Party conventions, right?
Yep.
So there are serious policy differences, but like as a human being, I still feel like there's movement and a place there. This is why I say I get it, why people want to vote, whether it's third party or they want to stay out. I do not understand I'm going to stick it to everybody else by voting for Trump, right? Like that part, there was no moral high ground there. That just seems like a really weird, twisted kind of revenge that you are like, apni naak kaat rahe ho. Like that's what you're doing.
Yeah. And I mean, this was the thing I was telling somebody.
Oh, and the one other thing I wanted to
Yeah.
mention about why Michigan in particular, I think, has gotten very interesting. So the guy who was kicked out of that one event had been the challenger to the sitting congresswoman for the area. So I think it had more to do with that he was there, rather than like, oh, oops, we just kicked out a Muslim American leader, right? Like I think it was some of that own internal Michigan politics. That said, the war in Lebanon has turned more Arab Americans against the current administration. And it's not like we tend to forget there's a significant Christian Arab American population. So you have, right, it's the Lebanese Christians,
Yeah.
Chaldeans, right? Folks who've been in Michigan for multiple generations who effectively identified as white, right? Not brown, not the AC, but like they're white people who have now also turned against the Biden administration, where previously they didn't necessarily care as much about, those Palestinians that everybody else in the Arab world tends to ignore as well. So that's the coalition. So that's actually who did this fancy dinner that led to money and that led to a spike in his Arab American numbers. It has to do with the war in Lebanon and IDF's actions there more so than what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah, and I think again, like my view collectively, I think you and I agree on this, right? Is that when the white supremacists are in power, whether you're Jose, Gibran, Jaspreet, or Jonah, even, and that's what history teaches us from Europe, that the white supremacists first will come for all of us.
Yes.
Right. And if you think that just because you're a bit different or you're wheatish in color, as South Asians typically like to say,
That's right.
that you will
Yes,
be
yes.
fine, that I'm like, you're mistaken. And if you think that
That's a
normalizing
generational
white supremacy is
difference.
like crazy, like how can you
I
go
think
down that path?
that first generation of immigrants, my parents and my parents, not necessarily, but there's still aspects of it that I understand from them and their age range. And so like, they're in their mid 70s now. That they really thought if they acted Gora enough in public, they'd be okay, right? Because they weren't like the Black people, right? That's a very Reagan era immigrant ideology because Reagan actively worked to message and communicate in that way, right? Like Reagan and his colleagues were working on this idea of the model minority, right? Like you are better than them. The reason they do that is because if you and them get together, you have more voting power and more share and access than just the Goras. Like that is a classic divide and conquer strategy. We saw this happen all the time in the subcontinent too. And I'm like, so how are you not seeing these colonial influences being done to you here in the US? So us, right? I was born here. You've been here for a long time. We have seen this first generation really challenged by that. And so, yes, I see people who are in their 50s and 60s sitting there on panels as executives. They see executives are like, oh, well, we can be race neutral. We can be race neutral. I'm like, really? Really? Once they find out that, I mean, like, JD Vance isn't even owning his wife's Hinduism right now. So let's start with that, right? Like, you really think they're going to be okay with that pagan stuff? You really think they're going to be okay with, kids named Jihad and Osama? Like, really? Okay. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Let's see what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the interesting bit as well. I've seen some of the exchanges like even Vivek Ramaswamy's had with the core MAGA people, and it's on the internet if you want to see, and you're like, hey man, he's one of yours, and you're like
Mm-mm.
giving him a hard time over his faith, and it's like it's that
Yeah.
evangelical core, right? That radical white nationalist Christian evangelical
Hmm.
core that is going to come after all of these people because they're seen as vermin, as Donald Trump refers
Hmm.
to it openly at times.
Hmm.
I want to switch gears and now go to the broader race and where
Yep.
we are. We're like basically, less than 2 weeks away from the election. It's still very close to toss up. Polls every day are driving people nuts and giving them
Hmm.
anxiety.
Yep.
I'm sure it's the same for you as it is for me. Like I'm like done looking at polls. But where are we? For people on this podcast, right? They follow American politics, but not super closely.
Hmm.
Like where are we, and what will it boil down to ultimately once the polls end and the counting begins?
Well, the harsh reality is that this is not a majoritarian rule, and that the majority will of the people is not directly reflected in how a president gets elected, right? So it's not a parliamentary democracy, and then you pick from that party their leader, and there you go, and you actually have a functioning government. It's actually a government that was designed to be in opposition. The three parts, you think it's a triangle, but triangles have hard angles, and the three branches of government are designed to be, the nice way of saying is checks and balances. The reality is they're in opposition. And that reflects at the state level. So the Electoral College is our reality. And it means that California and New York are a given. Usually on a normal, like Idaho and Wyoming are a given for a certain party. So it comes down to a handful of states to get to the number 270. That's the number you need to get to. You get to 270, you've won the election. That's the Electoral College votes you need. Each state has a certain number of those. Um, Kamala Harris needs to win Pennsylvania. If she does not win Pennsylvania, election night math means then she needs to win North Carolina and Nevada. So potentially the election could be over by the time we get returns on the East Coast, right? So you think polls close at 9 p.m. If it's gone really bad for Harris and she's lost, you would know by, I'd say 10 p.m. if she's lost Pennsylvania and North Carolina. That's East Coast, right?
And you're done at that
You're
point,
done.
right?
That's it. You're done. Now, if she's won Pennsylvania, different ballgame. If she's lost Pennsylvania and won North Carolina, then the contest really does continue. And then you get to Nevada, Arizona, and some of the states where you've had this business about voter fraud and alternate elector states and all of that. And that was, part of what led to and was part of this idea of the insurrection on January 6th, all of this. So that strategy, by the way, has not disappeared. Republican members of Congress, it's from Trump down, but Republican members of Congress still refuse to commit to accepting the election results. They say if it is free and fair, blah 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 blah. Like they are leaving room essentially to challenge the voting results. So your best case scenario is if there is a reason to think that Harris wins based on votes coming in from the western part of the United States, that's like, okay, gets you to like midnight East Coast time. Those are going to be challenged. We are unlikely to have a concession speech from Trump on that night, if ever. That's the reality, right? So the anxiety about it's not about election day as much as it is about will the results be accepted if she wins? And or if it's very, very close, does this end up being a Supreme Court case? Like, how long do we have to wait for this to all be over? That's the part that I'm like, oh my God. So
Yeah.
I'm like, hey, I'm going to early vote. I'm going to do what I can. And then I'm going to disconnect because doom scrolling and listening all the time isn't going to help me in my mental health at this point. But that's some of what has Americans feeling anxious because there's no reason to think that we're actually going to be resolved on election day, election night. Now, I get it for people living in Pakistan. They're like, what else is new? Like, this is kind of how we roll, right? Accusations of rigging and, pesa inko diya, all of this. Yeah, you know what? That's kind of new for Americans.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good thing. It's kind of new for Americans to experience that, but that's part of the problem. Americans don't know how to combat that and deal with that. They actually really, really did believe that their systems were going to work for them.
Yeah. I mean, the
Mhm.
headline I thought of like on January 6th, right? In 2020 when the riots had or the mob entered the Capitol was like if the New York Times were writing this about India or Pakistan, they would say nuclear armed country has violent transfer of power or unable to have peaceful transfer of power,
Mhm.
right? And the whole story would be about how nuclear weapons are at risk and you don't know where the military is going to stand over here and what's going to happen,
Yeah.
etc.
Oh, and also
And
in no other country are you actually in a democracy or even a country that pretends to be democracy, are you convicted of multiple crimes and not put in jail? Like
yeah,
we're the only country that seems to have an issue with that, with our
yeah,
leaders. And right, for a while, Biden's like, well, we don't do that. I'm like, you mean you don't hold people accountable for breaking the
yeah.
law?
I
Tell
mean,
me
it's
more
also
about that.
weird. The
Tell me more
United
about that.
States has this broad sort of, with the Supreme Court ruling on immunity as well, right? I'm like, countries all over the world, democracies, forget authoritarian or even
Mm.
hybrid democracies, like real democracies, jail their prime ministers and jail their presidents in
For
power.
corruption, tax evasion. Bolsonaro in Brazil had his people go to the, parliament building,
Yeah,
the equivalent of the Capitol, and essentially try to deny the transfer of power. They kicked him out of the country, said, you
yeah,
can't run again, right? So much like these experiences, I think, are actually relatable to people in Pakistan. But it's ironic because in America, it's newer and people are like, but we're trying to avoid doing what's already happened there, that's what makes me sad for the elders here. I'm like, if you don't want your twilight years in the American right in America to be like what you grew up experiencing as Pakistan was going through its transitions, then maybe you should think about that. Maybe
yeah.
you should consider that and not like you're our leader wo qaid ho gaya, and he's in solitary confinement and that's like the only thing that matters anymore.
Yeah. I want to ask as well, like, given you said Trump probably will never, and I agree, won't make a concession speech.
Hmm.
The election may go down to the wire, and then the Supreme Court. What are sort of like you hearing or picking up from the Democrats in terms of how they're going to combat this time
Yeah,
around?
so the
Because last time
lawyers,
it came, like, just for context for the audience, right?
yeah.
It came down to Mike Pence having honor and some level of, respect for the Constitution to say, fuck off, not doing what you're telling me to do. And they wanted to hang him. Literally, there are videos of
Yes,
mobs, people from
yes.
the mob saying, hang Mike Pence. Um,
There is transcript and sworn evidence of Donald Trump being told that his vice president, there was a noose out there for his vice president. He's like, don't
yeah.
care. That's his problem.
So now that that's
Mhm.
happened, what are you picking up and how are the Democrats planning to combat this time around? Because that's a high probability scenario, right? That Trump
Yes.
doesn't
So,
accept and there's more riots or mobs,
right, because
etc.
he's told us he's not going to accept, right?
Yeah.
Like, again, they have told us what they are going to do. Let's not pretend. They have told us what they're going to do. Project 2025 lays out the entire policy plan of how they and what they plan to do everywhere in government. The state-run experiments, the reason why people are freaking out about women's healthcare is because it's already happening in many states, right? So Trump, they have told us what they're going to do, and they've experimented and put it in place. A second Trump term will implement those things. Simple as that. So like that should be a given and understood. With that said, how these systems are being checked, Congress passed legislation after January 6th that they were not going to have this one day of formal certification where everybody had to gather in order to formally certify it. That they were just going to be like, okay, all the states sent in their stuff, great, it's certified, which I think is great. Like, let's take out this ceremonial target. It was ceremonial, entirely ceremonial, became its own thing. So just if all of the states send in their information about what happened and what's going on in their state, done. It should just be automatically got it. It's certified. So that's a good thing. The second thing is I think the lawsuits by these voting system companies really put companies like Fox News on notice to not spread this idea of voter fraud that is not true.
Which
Right?
again,
This
for
like
context, right? Tucker Carlson privately was saying the results
mhm,
are correct, but on
no,
Fox was saying that this was stolen.
right. Right. So the people who got on television and said it was stolen and it's because this, these voting systems don't work and that's how they can hack them. And yeah, that company sued them for almost $1 billion and Fox settled because the next step was going to be Fox having to release everything publicly in the discovery phase. And like, yeah, we don't want to do that. Right. Because it would not go in their favor. So they settled for more than $1 billion, which means that the biggest right-wing outlet on election night is going to be very, very careful about saying things like voter fraud or that, that's not right in that
The
state.
machines were hacked. Yeah.
Bingo. Right. So this idea of narratively undermining trust in voting systems, I think that's been dialed back. The opportunities to target the system and just disrupt it, that's also been dialed back. And this even Trump now is in favor of early voting and mail-in ballots because he realized, oh, all of these hillbillies in North Carolina that were going to be my voters, what are they going to do now that the floods moved everything away? I want them to vote. Help them vote. Right. So there are places that like swing states where now even the Trump campaign is saying the easier access to the ballots is a good thing. This is all very nerdy. I get it. But it is the kind of stuff that's like, okay, these are the holes in the system that were plugged up along the way. I still think, the idea that we have somebody who refuses to acknowledge defeat and that there is a congressional party underneath him that's willing to help him do that, they will probably find novel ways to challenge the election. But, there's plenty of lawyers on the other side as well.
Yeah.
So state by state, I think it can be kind of normal. The bigger challenge is if this goes to the Supreme Court, and that's already been stacked against Democrats.
Yeah. So the follow-on question also related to that, right, is what happened to the Republican Party? That's a big question. Well, let me
It's actually not that hard, actually, I think, to answer.
But
It's really not.
yeah, but related to that, my question is, assume if you were to have a scenario where Donald Trump loses, he's a loser. He's lost 3 consecutive elections now.
He's had
Something
11
that's
bankruptcies. Like, there's so many things
right.
about him, but he's like this idea and mythology he's
Yeah.
created, this cult of personality he's created. I find it fascinating. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow,
He's
you
a
really are that
political, like,
guy.
this is my thing, right? Like, political parties are in the business of winning elections. They've been captured. The Republican Party has been captured by this loser who has been peddling their money that they raised towards his own legal fees, who has lost 3 elections, and who has not been able to sort of get back anywhere near to winning net new voters that are important for the Republican Party to maintain power. So they've been on a losing streak. My question to you is, under the scenario where, let's say, he loses again, do you anticipate that the Republican Party sort of has an internal coup to get rid of the MAGA influence, or
No,
do we keep going to MAGA 3?
why didn't they do that after he lost the first time? He
Yeah.
did not win the last election. He didn't win the popular vote and he didn't win the electoral college. So
Then
they
he got
didn't do that
shellacked
last
on the
time.
midterms by his but the
They didn't
candidates that
do
he
that
picked.
before.
Yeah.
So I think there's 2 things that have been very potent for how MAGA's taken over the Republican Party. The Republican Party has been bleeding new Americans, whether those be younger voters who just are like, we don't relate to any of the quote unquote family values that you talk about. So like anybody under the age of 40 was not a natural Republican anymore. And by this election, the majority of the electorate will be under the age of 55 for the first time. Right. So that younger voters already gone for the Republican Party as of like 10 years ago. And they saw this coming. By 2040, we're going to be a majority minority country, meaning either you will have at least one other ethnicity that you're checking on the box. That is terrifying to what used to be a white male dominated society. Terrifying. That is also part of what they're operating with.
Yeah, that America will no longer be a white Christian nation. Essentially, that's
yes, right. Like that idea of like the people are like, we'll accept pluralism if we can still do our Christian thing anytime we want. Like that group is suddenly like, oh, wait a second. You mean we actually have to accept pluralism? I'm not, absent being able to legislate, I'm not going to be able to tell other people what to do. That feels like a loss, right? When you're no longer the only person in power, it feels like a loss. It feels like oppression, right? So that oppression narrative, that victim narrative, why do you think it's Make America Great Again? Because they think that the 1950s was the heyday, right? Like that was the era. And the whole playing on masculinity, please. Like we haven't seen that playbook happen in the subcontinent over and over and over, right? Like what it means to be a real man, and those educated elites, they don't know what they're talking about. And again, I respect that unions in the United States, like unions which represent the workers, have completely outclassed Desi activists and Pakistani doctor activists when it comes to how to handle this election, right? Like you got played by the truck drivers and the cashier workers. Like they handled politics in America better than the doctors who've been here for 40 years. That's part of why I was so frustrated by that endorsement. Yeah. But moving on, that's the MAGA movement, and it's very potent. And you don't need that to be 60%. You need that to be a solid 40%. Of what you're doing. Like that is a base. That is a solid base. They're not going to go anywhere else. You just keep feeding them what they want to hear. That's your people. You have to add on to that. So Trump has never broken 47% of the vote. Why we're freaking out about polls is because everything is within the margin of error, right? So like you have these tabulations, and then you have a margin of error in any study. Like, well, plus or minus 3 points. All right, well, plus or minus 3 points is literally the spread, the difference between 49 and 51.
Yeah, so and that's either which way it breaks, to your point, right? Like it's basically the night is over at 10 p.m. from East Coast time, or we're in for a long haul 5 a.m. night.
But the polls, people are hoping that polls will tell them and give them a sense of direction, and they're not going to do that. You're not going to get a sense of direction of what's happening in the next 10 days and have it feel like anything that's substantive or real. It's all going to be in the margin of error. Now, am I baffled at times that this is how close things are when I see such a sharp contrast? Yes, but that is not our reality today. The reality is every poll going forward is going to be within the margin of error, which is why the idea of every vote counting is very, very real. In places like Michigan and Florida, Jill Stein, the third party candidate, had more voters for her than the margin that Trump won by in those states, right? So Trump winning certain red states was required, I won't say it's due, but required a certain number of the population, significant number of the voting population, to vote third party. That's where you start to see in certain states and cities, Green Party candidates get funded by Republicans because they think that third vote gets pulled from the Democrats. Yeah. Jill Stein will tell you, no, the people who vote for me would never have voted for Harris anyway. I just took votes away from Trump. Depends on who it is, right? Like depends on who the third party candidate is. But in our two-party democracy or two-party system, one third party, candidate on a ballot, yes, absolutely. If you took that third party away, either the person would have stayed home or they would have voted for somebody else, like one of those other two candidates. And that's the fact that 1.5 million voters in a state where Trump won by 40,000 voters. Yes, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
That's why they like the idea of like every vote counts. Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. Now coming to the Democrats, right? Vice President Harris has talked of her as a generational shift in the party. Mm-hmm. That's part of her pitch. Mostly correct. She comes from a different background, has a different legacy, and a rise up from a different generation of the party. But one thing, again, coming back to foreign policy, but also domestic policy.
Do you think that, I just hit me. Do you think that some of the Pakistanis who don't want to vote for Kamala Harris is because her mom was Indian?
I don't think that's part of their calculus.
Okay.
No.
You don't think it's that basic, right? Okay,
no, I don't think. I think it's like
there was a moment. They're like, hey, we can't vote for Al Gore because he's got a Jewish guy as a vice president. So yeah, let's just do George Bush, and he gives us Iraq war. But that was very, very real back then.
Yeah. No, I think it's this weird issue primarily around Imran Khan, which again, I'm less like, I think I told one of the uncles jokingly in a conversation earlier this week, was like, yeah, you guys are banking on Donald Trump to free Imran Khan so that he can build Riyasat-e-Medina, and then Donald Trump is going to tell you to get the fuck out of America and go build Riyasat-e-Medina in Pakistan.
Yeah, literally. Who do you think's going to work that?
Yeah, good luck
Yeah.
with that conversation,
Well,
right? But
also the idea of like, oh, they'll be receptive to hearing from Pakistanis on policy. I'm like, really? You mean all of us who actually worked our entire careers to actually be in the position to influence policy, you're going to make sure we never get into government again?
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
So coming to the Democrat Party, right?
Yeah.
Vice President Harris has said she's a generational transition. You obviously cut your teeth under the Obama
Mhm.
administration, which was a big
Oh, no.
generational.
Just for context, I go back to Dick Gephardt. This is
Okay.
like, yeah, no, I go back
Okay.
to, I remember the vote for the Iraq War. I remember the Axis of Evil speech
The
delivered on the House
conversation.
floor because I was on the House floor when that got delivered. So I'm
Okay.
pre 9/11
You're pre
era
9/11.
of, yes, I'm
Okay.
I'm older than I look, Janam.
You're dating
Mm,
yourself on a podcast, which is awesome. But I mean, the way I think about it, like Barack, as you were alluding
mhm.
to on the Palestine conversation in particular, but Barack Obama brought a different sort of diversity
Yeah.
to the White House and to national security policy making and policy making writ large, a different way of thinking about
Hmm.
America's place in the world and our domestic economy with the financial crisis, et cetera. Joe Biden clearly had the old guard from his Senate days and his VP days around him, and
Hmm.
he's a loyalist in that sense, which
Hmm.
is also interesting that doesn't get picked up in the media about how much more of a loyalist he also is like Donald Trump, but that's
Oh,
beside
no, he's a loyalist and he's an institutionalist.
correct.
Hmm.
So he's brought in his own people. And my question to you is, in the scenario that Vice President Harris becomes president, are we going to truly see a change of personnel generationally in American policy making? Because personnel is policy.
Yes.
And I wanted to understand, because you understand the party much better than I do,
Hmm.
what could happen with what are the possibilities here in terms of personnel changes, diversity, more inclusive debate within the party and within the administration under Kamala Harris?
I think there's two things at play here. One is that Democrats often tend to give political positions to people who have demonstrated expertise in the ideas, right? So whether they're think tanks or academic institutions or local or state people who've worked on the issues, that tends to be who they pull in for political appointments. Republicans tend to pull in people for political appointments who are deeply connected to business. So that sense of like operational acumen, but they're not the let's change big ideas. Now, it makes the political machine on the Republican side very effective at executing a very targeted, specific agenda. What the Democrats end up doing, though, is the way they end up staffing and where they pull staff from is you do end up with changing ideas and debate, and just by default about the aging and the demographics, right? I mean, it's going to be a younger and more diverse pipeline because that's literally what is available in the country right now,
Mm.
right? Biden wasn't even a boomer, he was silent generation, right? So his loyalists are not the people that Kamala Harris came up with, right? The idea that we even talk about HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and Howard University is in and of itself like this, her experiences, and then again, the people she came up with, and then their reflective networks just are fundamentally different. Like they look like more of what America is.
Mm.
So I think that's just the nature of generational change if you don't resist it and you embrace it. I will say this, Biden did appoint the most diverse uh, government in history. Like that is actually something that his team worked really hard on, and the number of women, the number of Muslim people, Desi people of different persuasions, like it really like they outperformed all benchmarks. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we got the policies we wanted, because yes, it's still Biden in charge. So is there space for Harris to grow and do that? Yes, absolutely. She was vice president. She's not the president, right? Like every vice president ends up pivoting or changing what they do when they actually get in power. She clearly understands that her job right now is to make sure that she capitalizes on the good things done under Biden without undermining that,
Mm.
right? So the Biden, good things about the Biden economy, she wants to continue talking about that. The good things about relationships with global community, she wants to capitalize on that. But she doesn't have a lot of room, I would say, to deviate from Biden. This is their calculus right now. I might disagree because I think 2 weeks before an election, what you really need to make sure is you get your people to turn out to vote. This is not persuasion time. This is not time to convince new people who you haven't been able to reach before. This is make your people turn out. That's generally what this get out the vote operation is. Um, so there may be a tactical difference there, but she has signaled where she can that, and it doesn't take much, I guess, on Gaza and Palestinian issues to be a little bit, more humane than what Biden has presented. But she came out well before he did, talking about Palestinian lives, right? She's early on talking about and says Palestinian sovereignty. That is a very key word for Palestinians. Sovereignty. It means their own ability to identify and create their own livelihood and moving forward. It doesn't have to be a Palestinian state if there's equal rights in Israel, right? Like, so sovereignty is a huge thing, self-determination. She stood next to Netanyahu and is the only one in the administration who stood next to him in public and said, you need to protect Palestinian rights and you need a two-state solution. Personally, I don't think a two-state solution can happen. Like, where is the land that is unoccupied that you can create a state with?
Yeah.
But these are like the tiny places where she can do that without being accused of undermining the sitting president. I think in the campaign's mind, in her mind, they have overweighted on this idea of showing that she can be a commander in chief and be solid, and not connected the dots as well on how foreign policy is a domestic issue. So that actually worries me, because I think that's a big disconnect, but I understand where that comes from and I understand the challenge that she's in. I just wish it could be navigated better right now.
That's interesting, right? And I think also, I mean, I keep going back to Professor Dresner, who was my professor at Fletcher School, and he keeps writing and reinforcing this point on his Substack as well, that the data says foreign policy doesn't really move elections. So to me, also from that, if I were to put myself in the campaign office mindset, right?
Yeah.
I'd be like, there's only downside to talking a lot about foreign policy right now, because you would be undermining the president's position.
Undermining the president, and you're alienating somebody else when you take a position. So you might gain this, but you're alienating them.
Correct. And so since, the data clearly shows foreign policy doesn't move the electoral
Dude, it's
needle.
literally not in the top 10. Let's be clear.
Correct. Yeah.
It's not in the top 10.
I think also people forget, who focus on foreign policy a lot, that it's their inner circle that cares about this, but Main Street Americans don't
But
really.
they do forget. This is where I think diaspora communities that are not foreign policy experts, but diaspora people who feel connections to two places. Had to leave his country, happy to put sanctions on him. They have been loyal Republicans since then. They also had a ton of money, right? That was the elites, the people with money who fled Cuba and landed in Florida. A big part of why Florida is the way it is today politically. You have 600,000 Polish people, Americans in Pennsylvania. Oh, you better bet that the Harris campaign is talking to them every day about how Trump supports Putin and what comes next after Ukraine. What do ambitions? Like they absolutely are focusing. So there are oh my gosh, 500,000 Haitian American citizens in Florida. Do you think they're going to be voting Republican after what Donald Trump and JD Vance have been saying about Haitians and that they eat animals? No. So it does connect, not directly because of the policy, but because of the feeling that a candidate can give a community. They are seen, that they're recognized as being part of the American fabric. That is literally, I think, why everybody participates in this, in government or public service or voting, is because, like, yeah, I'm here, I'm part of this. And diaspora communities want that. So who can give them that, separate from foreign policy, but who can give them that? That person's going to get their vote.
Yeah. That's a good place to end this conversation, I think, because that ultimately comes down to that fundamental question, right? Like, who sees me, who hears me, and who is going to ultimately make sure that I'm included in this broader American dream, however you want to define it. And I think that perhaps is the biggest weakness of the Republican Party as it stands today, is like it's become so exclusionary. That I'm like, dude, you guys can pick up a whole lot of brown and black people and Latinos and Haitians and Cubans and Venezuelans, a whole lot more, if you just dial down on your xenophobia.
It's not going to happen.
It's
When you
not
have
gonna.
Republicans in Maine saying that their number one voting issue is what's happening on the southern border,
Yeah.
Maine is as far as you can get from the southern border, right? They have drilled in on their community and their voters that the vermin from the South, the shithole countries, blame those people for all your problems. It has nothing to do with facts and reality anymore. So no, I don't feel safe with Trump as a president. Simple as that.
Yeah.
Right. And if Trump is reelected, hands down, I will be using my parents' knowledge of how not to get picked up they're like, don't protest. Just, keep your head down, do your work, take care of yourself. Like that's the kind of logic, right? Like, and the value set that you end up creating and having to bring back on. So yes, to me, Trump getting elected with diaspora support is fundamentally a failure of the promise of the American dream.
That's a good place to end this discussion, Nayyera. Thank you so much for taking out the time on a late Thursday night. Always a pleasure talking to you. And I think I'm going to follow your advice and not doom scroll
Don't
on
doom scroll.
election
But
night.
I will say
So
that this was like the most Pakistani conversation I've had in a long time. Where like बच्चों को सुलाने के बाद हम बैठ के politics की बात कर रहे हैं.
that's how it goes. We just didn't eat nihari before that, or biryani.
You
So
didn't
there you
offer
go.
any. You didn't offer
Sorry.
any.
I'll send you over some next time. Take care. Have a good one. Bye.